Welcome to Stories from the Mat with Jan, a quiet place for families, educators and experts to come together and build confident learners from the very beginning. I'm Jan. Let's begin. The story hasn't changed. In episode 3, we met with children's author Laura Strachan. After the episode, I found myself thinking about a different question. Before children become confident learners, how do they become confident in the first place? It sounds like a simple question, yet I think it lies at the heart of so much that has happened during childhood. Welcome to Stories from the Mat with Jan. I'm Jan Falconer. I'm a wife, mother, sister, cousin, aunt, nonna, and a children's author, and someone who spent a lifetime watching children learn. After our conversation with children's author Linda Murphy, we explored what it means to believe children can learn. We talked about confidence. We talked about recognizing that there is no average child. We reflected on giving children time to learn in their own way and at their own pace. Since speaking with Laura, I found myself thinking about a different question. Before children become confident learners, how do they become confident in the first place? Laura spoke about many wonderful things during our conversation. Kindness, illustrations, imagination, and family. But one idea stayed with me long after we'd finished recording. She noticed that children often ask for the same story again and again and again. Not once, not twice, sometimes dozens of times. As an adult, we sometimes smile and wonder why. Surely they already know the story. Surely they'd rather hear something new. But Laura gently challenged that assumption, explaining that every time a child returns to a familiar story, something different is happening. The story hasn't changed. The child has. That one observation made me stop and think. Like many grandparents, I've lost count of how many times I've read the same books. Stickman, Harry McCleary, Zog. And now Laura's own stories, Pickles the Mermaid and Rainy's Journey. If I'm honest, there have been evenings when I've wondered whether I might choose a different book. Laura has helped me see those moments rather differently. Perhaps children aren't asking us to read the same story because they need another story. Perhaps they're asking because they're becoming a different reader every time they hear it. The first time, they're following the adventure. The next time, they notice a picture they hadn't noticed before. Then they begin joining in the familiar phrases. Soon, they're predicting what happens next. Before long, they're turning the pages before we do. Without anyone noticing it, they're becoming more confident. That confidence isn't building through pressure. It's not building through tests. It isn't built by hurrying children to move on to the next book. It grows quietly, almost unnoticed. Laura shared a wonderful example from her years as a teacher. She spoke about helping a 14-year-old boy with his dyslexia who had never learnt to read. What fascinated her, while she concentrated on the words, he was reading the illustrations. He'd noticed details that were completely overlooked by her. The pictures were telling him the story. In many ways, he understood what was happening before the words caught up again. I found this remarkable, reminding me again of Todd Rose and his work on the myth of the average. There isn't one right way to learn. Some children read words, some read pictures, others remember sounds, and there are those who remember rhythms. Some ask endless questions, and others simply watch. They are all learning. They're simply taking different paths, as Linda Murphy reminded us. Perhaps they're simply taking a different route. Laura also described familiar stories as feeling like visiting an old friend. Think about your favourite book, or perhaps a film you've watched many, many times. Somehow you still enjoy returning to it. Children experience something very similar, except every time they return, it allows them to discover something new, because they themselves are changing. That is such a beautiful thought. It also reminded me of the work of developmental psychologist Kathy Hirsh-Pasek. She's spent all those years reminding us that young children learn best through warm relationships, shared experiences, and playful interactions. When we sit down with a child and read a story together, we may think we're simply reading words on a page, but so much more is actually happening. They're pointing out pictures, answering questions, laughing, wondering what might happen next, making connections, building vocabulary, sharing our attention, and creating memories. The stories become something we experience together. Roberta Golinkoff has also made a similar point. Children aren't passive recipients of information. They're active participants in making sense of the world around them. Perhaps that's why they interrupt all the time. They point. They ask questions. They notice tiny details we might have completely missed. As adults, we sometimes think those interruptions are taking us away from the story. Well, perhaps they are the story. Perhaps that conversation is where the deepest learning happens. And maybe that's why bedtime stories matter so much. Not because they're preparing children for school, but perhaps they're preparing children for learning itself. That's why I find myself thinking about the work of Jerome Bruner. Bruner believed that children don't simply learn something once and move on. Instead, they return to ideas again and again and again, each time understanding a little bit more than before. He called it a spiral curriculum. We often associate that with schools, but I sometimes wonder whether the first spiral curriculum begins much earlier than school. Perhaps it begins on someone's lap, and perhaps it begins with a favourite bedtime story, a nursery rhyme, a song, a familiar voice saying, "Shall we read this again?" Each time the story is shared, the child comes back a little older, a little wiser, a little more observant than before. The story stays the same, but the child doesn't. I think that's why families play such an important role in learning. Long before that child walks through the school gates, they've already been learning every single day. They've learned to recognize familiar faces and learned that a smile means something. They've learned to listen to voices, join in with songs, clap, point, laugh, and wonder. They've learned that books are places where adventures happen and where questions are welcome. Parents, grandparents, carers, and families are children's first teachers, often without realizing it. Not because they're delivering lessons, oh no, but because they're sharing life. School then builds on those foundations. They don't begin learning, they continue it. And I think that's an important distinction. We often talk about children being ready for school. Perhaps we should spend a little more time thinking about whether schools are ready for the wonderfully different children who walk through the school gates for the very first time. Children who have already spent years learning through conversations around the kitchen table, stories before bedtime, nursery rhymes in the car, walks through the park, baking together, gardening together, and asking 1,001 questions that begin with the word why. None of these moments appear on a school report card, yet every one of them matters. Laura's own story reminded me of that too. She began by helping a 14-year-old boy with dyslexia learning to read. She thought she was the teacher, but as time went on, first with him and then with the 19 children who became part of that remarkable family, she discovered something rather lovely. The children became her teachers too. They showed her which stories they kept coming back to, what caught their attention, and how illustrations could sometimes tell a story every bit as well as words. Somewhere along the way, they gave her the confidence to write stories of her own. I rather like that thought. Sometimes the greatest lessons don't travel in one direction. Children are constantly showing us how they learn, if we're willing to notice. Perhaps that's one of the reasons I enjoy spending so much time with my own grandchildren. Like many grandparents, I sometimes begin reading a story, thinking I'm the one sharing the story with them. Then one of them points out a tiny detail I've completely missed, or asks a question I'd never thought of myself, or laughs at something I hadn't realized was funny, and that happens a lot. I think one of the loveliest things about stories is they always have a way of connecting generations. A parent reads a favourite book to their child, and before you know it, that same child is reading it to their own children. And perhaps that's what Laura has really been describing. Not simply the joy of reading, but the joy of sharing. Stories create their own conversations. They create connections between the generations. The words stay remarkably similar. The voice changes. The people change. The memories grow. I suspect that's why so many of us still can remember stories from our childhood. We don't simply remember the book. We remember where we were, who was reading, the warmth of the room, the sound of a familiar voice. I remember how safe we felt. Perhaps That's what children are really asking for us to repeat. Not simply the words, but the feeling, the relationship, the reassurance that, just for a wee while, everything feels familiar and everything feels safe. So the next time you hear a little voice ask, "Can we read it again?" Perhaps you don't need to wonder whether they've already heard it. We can remember what Laura helped us notice. Every time we read that familiar story, the child beside us is just a little different from the one who heard it yesterday. They're just discovering another word, another picture, another connection, another piece of confidence, quietly, patiently, one familiar page at a time. Perhaps confidence isn't something children possess before learning begins. Perhaps confidence grows because learning feels safe enough to enjoy. And one of the greatest gifts we could give a child isn't finding a different story. It's simply being willing to read the same one just one more time. Thank you for joining me. Until the next time, this has been Stories from the Mat with Jan, a place to think, notice, and begin. So thank you for joining me. Until the next time, take care.